My name is Kijana Woodard, and I'm doing a talk on top mistakes using NServiceBus. So there's a couple of things that are horrible about going near the end of a conference. Is one, I can't like relax and enjoy the conference because the whole time I got to be panicked about doing this presentation. And the second one is that everybody else touches on the things in my slides, so I'm like frantically trying to oh my God, I got to change my topics or whatever. And apparently I was just told that now I have a cage match versus some of the other presenters because of the things that I'm going to say is going to contradict what they said. So we'll see how it goes. These slides, for what they're worth, are on GitHub, so you can feel free to go take a peek at those whenever you want. I live here in Dallas. I've been programming for, what did Jimmy say, 3 weeks? Been programming for a little while, and kind of independent contractor for 5 years or so. Around the web, I have a blog. It's hideously non-used. I think my last post was like 2013 or something. It's horrible. For whatever reason, I've kind of found I like posting on forums. So I do a lot of posting on forums. Like I don't do Stack Overflow very much except as a user, because that's the only way to code is copy from Stack Overflow. But I do post on forums, which I, for some reason, like. So I found NServiceBus, I think around 2010, and I went and took Jimmy's class, and it was very much sort of, this is the droid I've been looking for in terms of a framework. It's like it fit the mental model that I had always had from when I was, first started out of the way programming should be, and I could never find something that fit. And then I found NServiceBus. I was like, this is what I want. And of course, you get very excited about any new thing that you find, and it becomes the golden hammer that you're going to use, right? So every problem becomes an NServiceBus shaped nail that you want to hammer down. The purpose of this talk is to kind of go through some things that I've noticed are things that you probably don't want to do using NServiceBus. Replication. So it's interesting when you're looking at forum posts, because it's almost kind of like a detective story, because the person is inevitably like up against the wall on their project, and they write MSMQ sucks, right? Or it's slow, and for them, they have all this context in their head. They're very panicked about what's going on, and they're trying to get an answer really quick, so they type something and send it. But for the other person on the other side trying to answer the question, well, they're in the same boat. Like they have their own deadlines or whatever, and then you look at this email that comes in, MSMQ sucks, and you're like, well, look, working fine for me. What do you mean? So you have to kind of like draw out like what the actual problem is. Like, well, what do you mean it sucks? It's slow. I'm trying to send 10 million messages across, and it's slow. Like, well, what's slow? And then you kind of keep going, and then finally, like fifth chain in the thread, they finally say, well, we're trying to keep all the records in instance A of this database in sync with instance B of this database. And you kind of back up and like, that sounds like replication. Yeah, that's basically what I want to do. It's like, well, just turn on replication. Like delete all your NServiceBus code and just turn on SQL Server replication, turn on Raven replication. It'll work a lot better than trying to like hand roll this through C# code and making the requests and doing all this stuff. And sure enough, you turn it on and it's like, oh yeah, it's done. Like, great, right? But it's kind of one of the popular things that people try to like use it as like, but it's a bus. There's a transport. I want to transport all my data from A to B. It's like, well, it's not the only way to transport data. Similarly is ETL. And there's laughter because I guess this is controversial. So ETL is the same thing in the sense that, yes, you want to extract, transform, load some data, but there's an entire industry of tools that exist to sort of to solve this problem. And before you say, oh, let me just go and spin up an NServiceBus endpoint to do this, is there some other tool that we can just grab and sort of plug in and make this happen, right? Similar kind of concept, right? RBAR database interactions, right? So RBAR is row by agonizing row. So it's like a term that DBAs use when your code is like torturing their database by, just one row at a time. So you have a relational database maybe, and relational databases are really good at set operations. But one thing that a lot of people tend to do with NServiceBus is take a problem that could be set-based, but change it into thousands of messages and then end up hitting the database one row at a time, when a better solution might be, hey, we can respond to, react to whatever event started this chain, and then just call maybe a stored procedure, gasp, a stored procedure that just operates on the data as a set, right? Like, I'm certainly no fan of stored procedures or anything like that, but they do have their place. Or whatever, you use micro ORM to run a set-based operation. But the point is, look at all the tools that are available to you and try to make better decisions. Similar to the ETL, well, on the ETL front, the other thing about that is just sort of looking at what possibilities are available outside of your normal expertise. Like Udi kind of touched on yesterday, as developers, we reach into that bag of tricks of writing code because that's what we're good at. So it's almost a higher level golden hammer. It's like, oh, we got to solve this problem by writing code. Well, as much as DevOps is sort of an overhyped term, like if you actually have a good relationship with DBAs and your ops people, which might be blasphemous for some of us, but they have a lot of knowledge and skills and tricks up their sleeves where maybe writing something in code is really tricky, but it's easy for them, for the ops guy in PowerShell, or there's some crazy database tool that your DBA has that can sort of do a lot of these things and take care of it. Because at the end of the day, like, our goal is to deliver business value, not to deliver a whole bunch of code. So if we can deliver code, if we can deliver the value and not write code, that's all for the better, right? I particularly don't like writing code that I don't need to. It's great to just sit around and let stuff get done. High volume messages or high volume, low value messages. One example of this would be like tweets or something. Another example, like I did a job at a stock market trading software company. And so you have all of this market data flowing in at you, right? And as an aggregate, the data is extremely valuable, right? Like this, people make fortunes from this market data. But any individual tick that comes from the market, in and of itself, is not that important. What's really important is speed, right? And lowering latency. So, if you're going to do algorithmic trading, you're not going to put NServiceBus in the middle to make sure you don't lose any of those ticks, because if your endpoint that was processing was going to fail, by the time it comes up, all those ticks that you have on disk are useless. You've already received 24 ticks to replace those for any given symbol, right? So it's funny because like the real algorithmic traders, like they have specialized hardware that's running in a computer that's 100 feet away from the exchange's computers, right? Like there's no storage of information whatsoever. It's just like taking things off the wire and making trades, right? So this is another example where people are like, I'm trying to run millions of examples through this durable queue, or sorry, millions of messages through this durable queue. Like, well, what are you doing? I'm trying to process stock market data. Like, why would you do that? Like, it's, just take it and process it. Now, it's funny because they do actually record all this data, but it's all out of band from, the algorithmic trading and the rest of it. It's like we're going to take we're going to take the data at the end of the pipeline and store it to disk so that we can do, back testing and all sorts of analysis later, but that's not in the way of the main processing. Messages that are too fine-grained. I've actually run across a few times where I'll see something like, you can think of it like a form post, right? And it's like a typical form post. But what happens is the code that handles that post will end up breaking it down and saying, create first name, create last name, create address 1, create address 2. And I was kind of looking at this code, and then you go into the handler for that, and all of those handlers end up updating the same record, right? Whether row or document. So all you're doing is like creating contention for yourself, right? Like so they're spawning off all these messages, and then when they process them, they're contending on the same row. And so you just end up slowing yourself down. But it's kind of like this goal of having, I'm going to have very fine-grained messages that will be very flexible, but it just ends up causing you problems. Does that make sense? And the flip side of that is messages that are too coarse-grained, where it effectively amounts to something happened, but it doesn't really mean anything. Like no actual consumer could actually do anything with it. Something about this thing changed. Like, okay, what do I do with that? Like, the only possible thing you could do is, I have a previous state, and I have the current state that you just sent me, and I'll diff it, and then I'll figure out what changed and do like, well, if I'm gonna go through all that, could you just do that once as the producer and then tell me what actually changed? Like that would be more useful. So you kind of see these messages where a lot of times I think we're just getting started with messaging. We don't really know what to do, so we're just doing something, but there's no reasonable consumer that could sort of process that message. So probably doesn't need to be an event yet, if that makes any sense. So one of the things that I fear the most when talking with business people is when they say, hey, I've discovered a new SaaS product that we should integrate with, but it'll be easy because they have an API. Like that's always just like the worst sinking feeling, because it's never easy integrating with anybody's API, right? So I don't know how many of you have used QuickBooks API, anybody? Hands? The QuickBooks Online, it is a glorious, glorious piece of work that makes me grin and smile every day. So one of its attributes, out of many of its wonderful things that it is it's slow. So you can get this idea like, what we should do is like spin up more endpoints or at least more threads, and now we can sort of send our data over to QuickBooks in parallel, and this will be better. Well, it turns out that QuickBooks has rate limiting, and it took me an hour of searching once I had actually gotten the response that says that it was rate limiting to actually find documentation about the rate limiting. So surprise, surprise, it does have rate limiting, and it's something ridiculous like 10 requests per minute. So actually scaling out will eventually end you up with a bunch of messages in the error queue, so you didn't actually get any faster at all, right? But in a lot of ways, like that is a better outcome than a less resilient web service that maybe somebody in your organization wrote that just goes down when you give it too much traffic, right? So effectively, your attempt to sort of scale up your process by making up these new endpoints is really you've just created a botnet that's DOSing your own systems. So it's something to be aware of. Queries. This one's really popular with people that are new to NServiceBus. And I think it makes a lot of sense, because you're saying, hey, I've just figured out how to do these asynchronous writes, and it's working well, and I'm loving it. Now I want to do queries with it. And so from a symmetric point of view, it makes sense. But when you really boil it down, it's like, okay, what's the happy path with a write? It's like, okay, we received this order, we wrote it to durable queue, the endpoint went down, 2 hours later, endpoint comes back up, processes the order, it gets shipped, everybody's happy, business is happy, yay. Okay, well, on a query, what happens? User asks a question, the query goes to a durable queue, the endpoint goes down, 2 hours later. Like, okay, wait, this doesn't make any sense. Like, 2 hours later, they've hit F5 500 times. Now there's 500 messages in the queue. They've sent off an angry email to the whole company saying how your software sucks. I mean, it's just a disaster. And then the endpoint comes up and the client isn't there. Like, it just doesn't really add any value. You've kind of have this extra layer of abstraction to make it durable, but there's no value in being durable because they're not going to wait around for the response. Async commands from the UI. I guess this one might be controversial too. This is sort of the SignalR presentation that Sam did yesterday. The problem for me here is that, again, the canonical example of using NServiceBus like in an order flow is the Amazon order flow. And at the end of the process, it says, thank you for your order. And then asynchronously, like everything happens, like billing and shipping and all this stuff, and it's all happy, right? But the thing there is that the user is expecting that that's going to be an asynchronous thing. They have no expectation that instantly the package is going to show up. Well, I mean, maybe very soon we're going to expect that instantly it shows up. It's getting faster and faster. But they know that there's a time delay. So saying thank you for your order makes perfect sense to them. But if you're saying, oh, I went into this user and I changed the name from Bob to Robert, right? When the screen comes back, like I'm just expecting to see Robert there. And if I don't see that, I just think it's broken, right? Like if there's any kind of eventual consistency there, I'm just gonna say, hey, your app is broken. Here's another angry email going out to the world that this app sucks, right? So like the difference is, in the first case, you're changing context, and the user expects it from a UI point of view. In the second case, you're really just updating data in the same context. So just update the data and then show it to them. Now, I can't really think of a reason why you need to publish that, a name change, but let's just say there is one. You could still publish an event and let other contexts know that this happened and they can react to it asynchronously. It doesn't have to be fully consistent to everyone in every part of the system, but for that user, it should be a consistent experience. iCallback. Does anybody not know what the iCallback interface is? If you don't know what it is, that's great. Just continue not knowing about it. This is one of these features that, I don't know, I've never really liked. RavenDB has a similar feature where you can save documents with an integer ID or a GUID ID, and they're sort of meant as transitional features for, oh, I've been doing things this other way, and now I'm just going to come over and do it. I'm going to do it in NServiceBus, or I'm going to do a document database, and I don't really want to change the way I think. So just let me keep doing things sort of the way I'm doing it, and it sort of works, and that's the problem, right? Like it kind of works for a while, and then it's a horrible, horrible flame out, and now you have to go back and kind of rethink everything. And it's better if you're already saying, hey, we're going to try this new stuff, just to kind of think of the new things up front. And in essence, for actually the last couple of slides here, it's really the same story in the sense that the happy path doesn't take into account all of the failure vectors that you can get into, right? It's like with the SignalR solution, if you say, oh, because again, on the forums, the question will come in, how do I wire up a hub to my NServiceBus? And like, that's not the hard part. Getting a happy path message flow of a SignalR response down to the browser is not the hard part. Like putting up a font awesome spinner and blocking the UI in a modal is not the hard part. The hard part is what happens when that doesn't work. Like, again, the whole reason we have this durable message is because things can go down. Well, if the response doesn't come back, what do? Like, okay, do you have to have a timeout that says, well, I've been waiting for how long? 2 minutes, 2 seconds, a case-by-case basis? Is that configurable? Okay, like, let's say that you actually say, oh, okay, well, I'm going to stop and tell them that something went wrong. What happened to the request? Do you have any idea? Like, did it succeed halfway, fully? Did you just not get the reply? Did it go off at all? You have no idea what to do. You have no idea what to tell the user what to do. And then, let's say that the message actually did get processed. 2 hours later, the endpoint comes up and then like sends the SignalR response. Does your app say, oh, look, you just finished. Let me take you to the details page. It's like, wait, I was right in the middle of something else. Like, so now you have to accommodate like what happens if this thing comes back later. So if you haven't really thought through like all those scenarios and what they mean, like just saying, hey, how do I wire up SignalR? Like that's like the smallest part of your problem set, right? The single messages project, right? So we're going to shove all of our messages into one project, right? Everything. Events, commands, all of the different contexts, whatever we have. Well, the nice thing about that is it's convenient, right? Well, you just kind of have the one reference and everything just sort of works. The problem with that is actually the lack of friction, right? So it's very easy to sort of semantically get yourself in a situation where it's like, hey, why is context A sending a command to context B? They really shouldn't do that. And tools like ReSharper kind of help us with this stuff anyway, of sort of erasing friction, which is good, except that it sort of masks over friction that should be telling us like, hey, something's a little strange about what we're doing here. Either we're thinking about it wrong or we modeled it wrong or something, but when we just say, oh, Alt F5, and it works, you just kind of lose that moment to say like, this seems a little strange, I should back up here. One handlers project, kind of similar. It's like, oh, just shove all the handlers in one project and we'll just ship it. The very first NServiceBus project I did, it ended up like that. Well, it started out like that, I'll say. It was mainly because we were trying to get NServiceBus into the project and the managers finally approved it. I think something like 3 days before go live, like, yeah, you guys can do that. Great. So, we're kind of like learning and doing and ship it. And we put out this first thing and we thought, well, it won't be too bad because there's only like 5 handlers in this project. Lo and behold, one of those handlers was doing PDF processing with Expose, another very slow tool. And it had the one thing come in, it's doing the slow one, and then a bunch of fast ones would come in, and then eventually we used up all the threads, and they're all backed up with the slow messages, like nothing else could happen. Like, oh, this is terrible. So, we had a release pretty quickly to break those out into separate projects. But yeah, one handler project can work for your first cut, but it's not going to hold water very long. Like in my case, it didn't even really last a few hours in production before we knew it. We had to change it. Saga fan out and with replies. Jimmy kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. I think he did almost a whole talk about it last year. But the idea is like, say you have a Saga that's gonna, I don't know, do image processing, and you say like, okay, you have n number of images you need to process. So I'm gonna fan those out as separate commands so they'll get done, and then when they're done, they'll reply back to the Saga, and when everything's done, we'll say, publish an event that we're finished. Well, it's Jimmy touched on this. When that happens, what you end up with is concurrency on the Saga with the replies. So, here they are, they all fan out, and that's all great. So you're doing your 15 or whatever, 100 images all in parallel, and that seems fantastic. But those replies come back, and you're just getting concurrency, exception, concurrency over and over and over and over. And if you're really unlucky, what you end up with is the whole thing goes to error queue, and now somebody's got to intervene and try to retry them, and then they start concurrency exceptions again, and it's just really terrible. One interesting way around that is to have each one of those fan outs post its own status to like a row in a table or to a document. In one case, we had like these mapping documents where we had to know like, hey, this thing that we just fanned out to do, we need to have this ID stored. So once we had that document saved, all the Saga did was have its own timeout, wake up and say, hey, is everything mapped? And once you could say, yes, everything's mapped, then it was done. But that meant that there was no contention on the Saga itself. It just had a little timer that said, check to see if everything's done, check to see if everything's done. And it actually runs a lot better, especially when you have a lot of them going on all at once. So none of what I just said should be taken as gospel, right? Like none of what I just said is like a hard and fast rule that you should never do any of these things. It's really kind of like a guideline to say, I'm doing something that was on this slide at this talk. Do I know what I'm doing? Why am I doing this? just to kind of, it's again that friction point to trip you up to make you think about, what you're doing. And if I kind of go back through some of these guys, like the replication one, right? I think Andreas talked earlier, like, oh, if you're in multiple continents with AWS or Azure, right? Like you can't do replication between those. Okay, so, well, you have no choice. So you're gonna have to do your own replication scheme because the technology is actually blocking you, okay? There's an exception. ETL, like, okay, I've used SSIS, like, I get it, like, it's horrible, right? So if I can, applause, if I can farm out the SSIS work to some, unknowing DBA and they're happy doing it, knock yourself out. If I have to do it, well, I'm gonna probably try to write some NServiceBus code. But, I do take into account what I'm getting into, right? This may not be the best solution, but it may be the best solution if I have to do it in the in the smallest amount of time available. Yeah, I don't know any reason that you'd actually want to do that, so probably not that. I mean, maybe, like if you felt like it could be a thing. Yeah, no, not that. Queries, that's an interesting one. Like, again, there is an annoyance when you have to say, like, okay, well, in order to do these queries, we're going to use whatever your database library, access library is, framework, micro-RM, session thing, whatever. So now you've got to configure it with, the credentials and all this stuff. And like, okay, well, if you can't do that for some reason, then, oh, well, now we got to do some sort of microservices thing. So now we've got to set up some HTTP client to call over there, and now we've got to configure the URLs for that. And you're sitting there looking at it like, well, I already have this sort of configuration of where all these things are. Wouldn't it be nice if I could just sort of do this? And I can imagine a world in which that'd be nice. Like, I don't think it should be durable for the reasons I said before, but if you could somehow say, hey, I have a volatile queue that'll go over here and do it for queries, it's possible that it could work, but it'd be interesting, but not something that you could probably post to the forum about. The SignalR solution that Sam was showing yesterday, right? Again, conceptually in my mind, like I could think, man, this would be really cool if you could have an application that could be reactive like that. If you take something like, I don't know, Azure Portal, like I want to spin up a VM, and I know that that's going to take a while, fine, but I can go make some blob storage or whatever, but I can sort of make progress, and when those things are done, the alerts come in at the top, great. So that could be really cool, but again, it's more than just, hey, how do I wire this up? There's all these things, factors that you have to think about and recover from. No, never, do not. So that's pretty much sort of the theme that I want you to take is that yes, there's a lot of things that should be tripwires or friction into your development process to say, hey, maybe I want to rethink what I'm doing here, but you could have you could be the one that has the valid reason to do this other thing, but it's sort of like if we had a camping forum, and you post to the forum and say, hey, I'm thinking about going 500 miles out into the wilderness. I was just wondering if there were any cool wilderness survival apps for my phone. Like, no. Do not go into the woods, just stay in the state campgrounds. They have very nice places that are marked off with, state troopers. Like, you do not want to go out into the woods by yourself. Like, you don't know what you're doing. And, you might say, no, I know what I'm doing, but, okay, knock yourself out, right? Like, in general, if you want to go off the beaten track, there's nothing going to stop you, but, just be cognizant of, hey, you're kind of taking things into your own hands, and hopefully things work out. And if they do, like, please post and tell us how it worked out, and maybe we can all learn something and do something cool. So I think that's it. Any questions? I don't know where I am on time. Over? By what? Oh, wow. Okay, questions later. I will be available for today and tomorrow, so thank you.